Welcome to Econ Solutions, how to write a 25-mark essay. Now in this video we're going to be looking specifically at Econ 1, but a lot of the skills will be transferable and we will be focusing on the skills that you need in general for essays. So this is worth a watch whether you're trying to write an essay for Econ 1 or one of the other topics. In order to fully understand the 25-mark essay, you really have to look at it in the context of the entire course. So in this section we're just going to look at the bigger picture about what the 25 marker is really all about. This graphic here shows the cyclical nature of your course and also the cyclical nature of the 25 mark essay. So the cycle we have here is just the structure of your course. So you start with the market and you move through the market mechanism, market failure, government intervention and government failure. Why is it a cycle? Well, because you are taught from a free market perspective that the market mechanism is self-correcting. What do we mean by self-correcting? Well, we mean that the market will adjust itself according to the laws of supply and demand. So for example, if the price goes up, we would expect the demand to fall, and that is the market being self-correcting. However, the market can also fail, and you study things like externalities, monopolies, etc. to show that sometimes this self-correcting mechanism isn't quite delivering the socially optimal outcome. So we look to governments to intervene. We don't stand by idly and do nothing. However, governments in their interventions can fail. So if governments can fail, then maybe we should leave it up to the market. The market is self-correcting. However, the market can fail, so we should get governments to intervene. But again, governments may fail, so we should allow the market to do its job. And you see here why I refer to this as cyclical. Now the 25 marker runs in exactly the same way. You will be given an issue and asked to assess essentially, can the market be left to its own devices? Should we let the market self-correct? Or should we have a piece of government intervention? And you have to appreciate that cycle in the 25 marker. So the 25 marker is essentially saying to you, should we leave the market to its own devices? Or should we allow governments to intervene? And what are the consequences of that intervention? So essentially in your essay, you're pitching the government against the market, and that's really the essence of the 25 marker. So understand this and it will give you a good foundation on which to look at more complex issues like structure and skills. So going into a little bit more detail on the actual mechanics of the essay, we're just going to look here quickly at what skills the examiner is expecting to see and a rough structure on how we'll demonstrate those skills. And this will take us forward to actually looking at the skills in more detail and then putting together a rough paragraph structure that we can use to form the basis of our essay. So dealing with skills first, this is often called the skills hierarchy, and in essence it's a layering of more complex skills upon other skills which precede them. So they're in order of complexity really, and they're also in order of the amount of marks available. So if you want to get 25 out of 25, you need to be able to do knowledge, application, analysis and evaluation very well. To get slightly lower marks, you will only need to demonstrate a few of the skills at the start. The point being that the skills develop in complexity as we go through them. So dealing with the first one, knowledge, really the skill here is, do you know something about economics from the course? A very basic skill, very much about recall and rote learning. Not many marks available for that in a 25 mark essay. So that sort of is the basis of our hierarchy. Then on top of that we have application. This is slightly more complex than knowledge. This is saying, can you apply your knowledge to the case study? Can you take information from the case study and use it in conjunction with the knowledge you've got to say something interesting about the question? From application we move to analysis. Now analysis is more complex, and this is really about examining and investigating a particular event or consequence of an event, and we do this in our essay by looking at if-then sentences, causes and consequences, really trying to get into the basics of the structure of a piece of economics and why it's important to the case study. And then the final skill in the hierarchy for us is evaluation. Very much about, can you see the wider picture? Can you bring in the wider context? This is really about critical and lateral thinking, really crucial skills, not just at A-level economics, but generally in life. So it's key that you develop this here, because it will help you get great marks, but it will also help you in later life. And the structure we're going to use to show these skills to the examiner can loosely be put like this. Now we start with an intro. We introduce the rough context of our argument, what we're going to say, and often we'll include here a definition of a term in the question to simply tick off the knowledge marks. So that's where we show knowledge. We include a definition in the intro and we've shown that skill, so we've ticked that one off. And then we go to argument for and argument against intervention. And it's crucial in these paragraphs that we demonstrate application analysis and evaluation. We need to evaluate throughout the essay if we're going to get the real top marks, and we'll come to how we do that in the next section, so don't worry. And then the conclusion is about a big piece of evaluation, really getting the evaluation marks from the examiner in that conclusion. So what is application? Application in our context is about relating your economic knowledge to the case study. Can you make what you are about to say in the 25 marker specific to the case study you have been given? If you make it general, talk about things that aren't in the case study, you will limit yourself on getting the application marks and you'll really get a lower grade than you deserve. So it's not good enough to know the economics, you also have to be able to apply it to the case study you've been given. So you have to use the information in the case study to analyse and evaluate your economic ideas. So it's about relating things back to the case study every opportunity you have got. Here I have an example for you. So I have a quick extract here from a 25 marker that's on our website. You can download it, have a read through it, but this is just a quick sentence I've taken from there to show you how to apply. So here we have, consuming foods such as sugar and fat to the point of obesity generates negative externalities such as a cost burden on the NHS. That is a simple point that I have made based on specific information from the case study I was given in that question. So here I've even referenced where it has come from, and I think this is a really good habit to get into because it really highlights to the examiner, I have applied, I have taken information from the case study and I'm using it in my ideas. That's what that says to me. Extract T, line 7. So let's go to the case study. Here I've got it down the bottom. Extract T, line 7. A study by the National Audit Office estimates that obesity costs the National Health Service at least 500 million a year and a cost burden on the NHS. That's what I've said, that's what they've said, and that is an example of application. What is analysis? Analysis is really about investigating or examining the reason for or structure of something. Now that can sound quite complicated, but it's a good skill to learn and it's a good skill to understand, so it's worth taking the time to appreciate what this means. So it's worth taking the time to appreciate what this means, examining the reason for or structure of something. Okay, I'm going to show you a very quick and easy way of doing this in your A-level economics 25 mark essay. So for our purposes, analysis can be shown through a chain of reasoning. You may have heard that said to you by your economics tutors. And we're just going to go through what that means and how that shows us the reason for or structure of something, which will give us that analysis marks. What does it mean? It means you can show the knock-on effect of things. So I've given you an example here. Ignore the red bits for a second. I'll go through those in a minute. But I've given you an example here to just show what I'm talking about, how I'm going to show the reason for something or the structure of something. So why should you look before you cross the road? A simple answer to this might be because you might get hit by an oncoming car. That would show knowledge. That would show that you know the consequence or a consequence of not looking before you cross the road. But it doesn't really show analysis. It doesn't really show what the reason for looking is, what the kind of knock-on effects of not looking are. So you need to go into a little bit more detail, and that's really key. Analysis is about showing the detail as much as anything. The detail of what's going on. So let's just go through this one. If you don't look, you could step into traffic and get hit by a car. As a consequence, you could receive significant injuries. This would mean that you will need to go to the hospital. As a result, there will be an extra burden on the NHS. Furthermore, your injuries may mean that you are unable to work, and this could cause a loss of income. Consequently, you may fall behind on your mortgage payments and lose your home. As a result, and so on and so on. And as I've said here, this chain could carry on for as long as is logical. And this is a chain of reasoning. It's showing the knock-on effects of a simple event. And that shows you understand the structure of an event, and you understand the reason for doing things, and you can show the detail behind them. And that is really what analysis is about. So let's just go through why I have highlighted here various phrases in red. And the reason I've done this is because when showing the knock-on effect of things, it's really handy to have what I call analytical connectives. Analytical connectives. Now they show if-then statements. So if you don't do something or do something, then this will happen. That's what they're showing. So if you don't look before you step into the road, you may get hit by a car. As a consequence, so the next step in the chain, you need something to link the previous piece of the chain to the next piece. And that's an analytical connective, and that's what these phrases in red are doing here. They're linking the previous step with the next one. So it's just building in a really clear chain of reasoning which shows that you can analyze. And I'll show you a very specific economics example of that later on, but that's what analysis is. And this chain of reasoning, these analytical connectives, are really easy ways of showing the examiner that you can analyze. Yes, it's quite linear, but if you're struggling, it's a very good place to start, and it will certainly help you get up into the high marks on the 25 mark essay. What is evaluation? Evaluation is the most difficult skill to show. It's the highest level skill on the skills hierarchy, and if you want to get 25 marks on your essay, which obviously is everyone's aim, then this is the skill that you really need to understand and be able to show. So what is evaluation about? Evaluation is about bringing in the wider context, looking at the bigger picture, and seeing how variables interact in quite a large setting. It's not as simple as looking at linear relationships. If price rises, demand falls. That's a very linear relationship. It's about thinking, will that relationship always hold given other variables in the wider context? So is it always the case that when price rises, demand falls? Or might there be other things in that situation which will influence that event? And that's what evaluation is about. It's about bringing in those other situations, those other variables to interrogate that law. And obviously we can apply that to any law in economics, so we can evaluate anything that we deem fit. And so whatever essay you're asked to do, you can always evaluate. Whatever point you make, you can always evaluate it. It's also about showing you appreciate pros and cons, positives of arguments and negatives of arguments. That's very important, and that's very important evaluation. And it's about thinking about what will happen given other variables in the equation. And as I said earlier, simple linear relationships that we have, simple laws that we have in place in economics may not hold if we drop the ceteris paribus clause and start looking at other variables. What I mean by ceteris paribus is if you drop the fact that all other things within the economy are held equal, that law may not hold. So if price rises, demand falls, that law might not hold if other variables interact. So I've given a little example here. Again, this example can be found on our website, econsolutions.co.uk. You can download the whole essay that this has come from our essay page. So just go to that if you want to see the whole essay, and you'll find it there. I'm just going to go through this. The best option for consumers is to vastly improve the rail network so as to entice motorists away from road travel with a faster and more reliable train service. However, key term when evaluating. So this point that I'm making here is I've done a 25 mark essay, and now I'm evaluating one of the points that I put across in that essay, which that improving the rail network was the best way to get motorists away from using the road. But I'm going to throw in a however here, the key analytical phrase really. However, there are other variables in play, or other situations which need appreciation, or other sides of the argument, or pros or cons to this point, or a wider context which needs appreciation. So this is my point. The best option is to improve the rail network, but there are other variables, there's other sides of the argument, there's pros and cons to this, and there's a wider context to consider. So I'm going to consider a few of these things in my evaluation here. So however, this would require a large subsidy from the government, which may be difficult to achieve. Again, appreciating that it's not as simple as getting a large subsidy. This might be difficult to achieve given the money may need to come from elsewhere, Econ, and that governments are currently running large budget deficits. The wider context, looking at the bigger picture. Really good example of evaluation. Nevertheless, another key evaluative phrase. The government could potentially raise money with an extra fuel tax, considering another argument, and use this to invest in the rail network so that in the future more people consider rail as a genuine alternative for their commute to work. So here I have looked at the wider context, other sides of the argument, and other variables in play, pulled a few of those together to create a very quick and simple evaluation which will lead me towards getting 25 marks in the exam. And that's what evaluation is about. Here I've just put together some useful evaluative phrases for you to use. You can see them here, and they're just useful ways to indicate to the examiner that you are now evaluating. So if you start a sentence with however, the examiner is likely to put an E in the margin to signify evaluation, as they're now aware that you are evaluating. And that goes for each one of these phrases here. They're good ways to bring in other variables or to appreciate other points of view. So use these phrases in your paragraphs and they'll signify to the examiner that you are evaluating. So here I've put together a basic structure for paragraphs. I must stress that this is a basic structure. It will need a little bit of elaboration by yourselves, but it's a good place to start if you are struggling to pick up the marks that you desire. So the basic structure is as follows. We make a point, we apply, then we analyse, and finally we evaluate. Now if we follow that structure, we should pick up all the marks on the skills hierarchy that we require. So what do we mean by a point? So we're putting forward a point of view to start our paragraph. So our point of view here is that the government should intervene with a tax to correct the market failure. So that's the point of view that we're going to analyse and evaluate. Then we apply. Now, my application here is, this is because, as Extract C states, sugar is the leading cause of childhood obesity. Now I've referenced here Extract C, that's just to make sure that I pick up the application marks required. So I've made my point, I've been specific about this point and put it into context of the case study provided. Now I'm going to analyse. So a tax would cause the supply curve of sugary items to move to the left. So I'm beginning to get into detail about what a tax is. And then I start using my analytical connectives to build my chains of analysis or chains of reasoning. So I put in here, as a result, analytical connective, the examiner knows I'm analysing, and I say as a result there will be a price rise from PE to P1. I then need to build in the next chain of my analysis, so I use another analytical connective, consequently. So consequently consumers would have to ration their consumption and quantity would fall. So I've got a very short chain of reasoning here, or chain of analysis, which builds upon my earlier point. So I'm following a flow down here to make sure I address all the points on the skills hierarchy. But finally I must evaluate, so I pick an evaluative phrase. Here I picked however, and I bring in here the wider context, perhaps some pros and cons, and I begin to evaluate. So here I've written, however, the effectiveness of the tax depends upon the elasticity of demand for sugary goods. So I'm bringing in another variable, elasticity, and I'm going to assess the effectiveness of my first point based on that criteria. And that's a very basic structure for paragraphs. So here we have a sample paragraph for you to read, and what I'd like you to do is maybe just pause the video here and just highlight in your own minds the point, application, analysis and evaluation within this paragraph. Now we always start with our point, and our point here is, in order to improve the allocation of resources, the government may impose a tax on the processed foods. That's our point. Everything that we do from here, application, analysis, evaluation, is going to build upon that point of view. The next thing we do is to apply, and our application here is, this is because eating processed foods has negative effects for our health, such as heart disease, liver disease and obesity, and I've referenced there Extract D. So we know exactly where that's come from. The examiner knows that I've applied, that I'm putting my argument within the specific context of the case study. We then need to analyse, so we start delving into the detail of a tax and putting together a chain of reasoning which will function as our analysis. So it starts here, and we have a tax would have the effect of shifting the supply curve to the left and raising the price level. An increase in price brings the rationing mechanism into effect, and consumers who can no longer afford the processed foods will drop out of the market. This is seen as a contraction along the demand curve from equilibrium E to the new equilibrium of A. As a result of the price rise, quantity consumed falls from QE to Q1, and this brings the consumption level closer to the socially optimal outcome. Furthermore, a tax will also increase government tax revenues, and this money could be utilised to pay for the negative externalities caused by processed foods such as heart disease and obesity. So there we have a good chunk of analysis with our analytical connectives underlined there, and the references to the diagram there, they're fictional, but obviously you would have a genuine diagram to reference within that analysis. And we've just built a very strong and detailed piece of chain of reasoning which backs up our point, and we are going to get all the analysis marks on offer there. So then we need to move on to evaluate, and we can see here I've started with one of the key evaluative phrases, however. So we have, however, the effectiveness of this policy depends upon another evaluative phrase, depends upon the elasticity of demand for processed foods. So I've brought in there another variable, elasticity, which is showing the examiner I'm evaluating. Processed foods most likely have a relatively inelastic price elasticity of demand, and as such a tax would have limited effect on reducing the quantity consumed. Furthermore, another evaluative phrase, the government could overestimate the size of the tax due to imperfect information. So we're looking here at government failure. If you remember the cycle that we did right at the start, government failure is key if we're going to evaluate whether the government should intervene or not. So the government could overestimate the size of a tax due to imperfect information, and this could lead to an under or overestimation of the tax, leading to more or less consumption than is optimal. There is also an issue of equity, as the tax will affect all those who consume processed foods, even those who consume in moderation. So we've brought in a con of the tax. So we've got another variable, we've got government failure, and we've got a con of the tax there, and a possible another government failure as well. So if you go through that paragraph, that's a very nice example of the point application analysis evaluation structure. Have a look at that, go to the website, download some examples, and start getting into the habit of highlighting the point application analysis and evaluation, and then you can begin to start building that into your own paragraphs and getting 25 marks.